I came home early and looked through the glass. The woman kissing my husband was my own mother. On the table sat a transfer packet and blueprints for my inherited home. 10 minutes later, my father arrived with an estate lawyer and a title agent. By midnight, I understood. They were stealing my future with forged documents. I refused to cry. I will let them take the stage, then pull the rug out from under them. My name is Scarlett Romero. For the past 10 years, I have built a formidable career as a senior compliance director at Marrow and Finch Compliance Group. My entire professional existence is dedicated to finding the rot hiding beneath expensive layers of fresh paint. I am the woman corporate boards call when the financial ledgers look a little too perfect, when the profit margins balance with an eerie precision that suggests calculated human manipulation. I dissect internal fraud. I read patterns in chaos. I noticed the slight hesitation in a chief financial officer's voice, the missing emails in a server log, the conveniently deleted expense reports that point to millions of dollars being funneled into offshore accounts. My mind is permanently wired for investigation, strictly calibrated to suspect the flawless and question the pristine. Yet, the greatest, most devastating irony of my life is that I applied absolutely none of that professional paranoia to the walls of my own home. I live in Belhaven, Georgia, a wealthy coastal enclave where the ancient oak trees drip with heavy Spanish moss and the scandals are always hushed up over glasses of expensive bourbon at the exclusive yacht club. It is a town built on generational wealth and closely guarded secrets, where perfectly manicured lawns often hide deeply crumbling foundations. From the outside, my life fit right into this polished, high society diorama. I am 37 years old, a fiercely independent Latina woman who climbed the brutal corporate ladder with sheer grit and relentless focus. I truly thought I had built a stable, enviable reality. A massive part of that comfortable illusion was my husband, Cole Danner. Cole is 39, a man whose entire business and public persona are built on the concept of restoration. He is a highly sought-after architectural contractor specializing in historic preservation. He possesses a rugged but refined charm, the kind of man who looks equally natural wearing a tailored tuxedo at a charity gala as he does covered in sawdust while examining a century-old load-bearing beam. He intimately understands the unspoken rules of the upper crust, knowing exactly how to flatter a wealthy dowager into securing a lucrative bid for a massive renovation project. For a very long time, I believed his warmth was genuine. I believed our marriage was the solid, unshakable foundation upon which we were building our future. But looking back with the clarity of hindsight, the signs of a structural failure were always there, cleverly masked by his smooth reassurances and my own grueling, relentless work schedule. Then there is my mother. Vivian Romero is 59 years old, though she spends a steady fortune on cosmetic procedures to ensure no one in our social circle would ever dare to guess it. In Belhaven, Vivian is an absolute institution. She is the prominent, inescapable face of local heritage conservation fundraising, a woman who thrives on glittering galas, high-stakes silent auctions, and having her name printed in thick, glossy society magazines. Vivian is entirely obsessed with her public reputation, with curating the perfect image, and with always being seen in the exact right room, standing next to the exact right people. Growing up with Vivian was less like being raised by a loving parent and significantly more like being managed by a ruthless rival. I learned very early on that her affection was strictly conditional, tied entirely to how well my achievements reflected upon her. She never acted like a normal mother. There were no warm embraces, no quiet moments of comfort, no unconditional support. Instead, there was a constant, exhausting, unspoken competition. She competed with me for attention, for social status, and above all else, for absolute control. When I became successful in my own right, earning a corporate salary that easily dwarfed the trust funds of her wealthy peers' children, her maternal pride was always laced with a sharp, unmistakable envy. She desperately wanted me to be an extension of her own grandeur, a pretty, compliant accessory to parade at her charity events. not a sharp-edged corporate investigator who asked too many difficult questions. The true, enduring battleground between us, however, has always been a piece of real estate. The single most valuable possession in my life is not my extensive investment portfolio or my senior title at the compliance firm. It is Seabrook House. It is a sprawling, weathered, incredibly beautiful historic home sitting right on the edge of the riverbank. It was built several generations ago, and it belonged to my maternal grandmother, Alma Romero. When my grandmother passed away, her final wishes sent a shockwave through our family. The will was entirely ironclad. Alma left Seabrook House directly to me, bypassing my mother completely. My grandmother knew Vivian better than anyone alive. She knew that giving Vivian the deed to a historic property was exactly like handing a pyromaniac a fresh box of matches. Vivian would have immediately leveraged it, remortgaged it to the hilt, or turned it into a flashy circus for her own social advancement. But that logical truth did absolutely nothing to soften the catastrophic blow to my mother's towering ego. Vivian has never once bothered to hide her profound, venomous bitterness over the inheritance. She weaponized her resentment, turning it into a steady, daily stream of passive-aggressive remarks. At elegant dinner parties, she would sip her expensive wine and loudly lament to anyone listening that it was a profound tragedy the historic house belonged to someone so deeply entrenched in the soulless corporate world. She would offer a tight, artificial smile and tell her wealthy friends that I simply was not soft enough, not sensible enough, and frankly lacked the refined sensibility required to preserve a true family legacy. She actively painted me as a cold, calculating businesswoman who was letting a priceless piece of local history rot simply because I cared more about financial spreadsheets than my own flesh and blood. When I first took full ownership of Seabrook House, Cole was my loudest and biggest supporter. He seemed genuinely thrilled by the prospect of bringing the grand old estate back to its former, breathtaking glory. He eagerly offered to manage the complex restoration, acting as the primary contractor to save us money. It made perfect sense at the time. I had the necessary capital, and he had the professional expertise. At first, the process was deeply romantic. We would walk hand in hand through the dusty, echoing halls on Sunday afternoons, and he would point out the original crown molding, detailing exactly how he would meticulously strip away the years of neglect. But as the months slowly bled into a full year, his initial enthusiasm morphed into something dark and suffocating. Cole began to insert himself deeper and deeper into the administrative and legal side of the property. It started small, with him gently suggesting he handle the minor municipal permits, because my hours at the compliance firm were simply too long. Then the behavior escalated. He started thoroughly reviewing the architectural contracts, aggressively questioning my financial pacing, and bringing me thick stacks of authorization forms to sign while I was deeply distracted with overseas conference calls. He would slide a clipboard across the kitchen island, point to the bottom line, and assure me it was just a standard waiver for the plumbing subcontractors. I was so mentally exhausted by my own high-stakes job that I foolishly welcomed the help. I let him take the reins on the financial decisions regarding the historic house, trusting him implicitly as a wife trusts a husband. I genuinely thought my partner was taking a heavy burden off my tired shoulders. I did not realize he was systematically gathering the legal reins of my inheritance into his own greedy hands. The breaking point, the exact moment the entire flawless facade began to violently crumble, was supposed to be just another routine business trip. Marrow and Finch assigned me to lead a massive, high-pressure compliance audit for a major shipping logistics company. I had to travel to Savannah for 3 days. It was a standard corporate deployment. 3 days of interviewing nervous logistics executives, relentlessly tracking hidden digital paper trails, and cross-referencing obscure offshore accounts. The morning I left our Belhaven home, Cole kissed my forehead warmly, told me to absolutely crush the audit, and promised he would spend his entire weekend finalizing the new structural roof permits for Seabrook House. Vivian had called my cell phone right as I was putting my heavy suitcase into the trunk of my car, ostensibly to ask if I had remembered to write a donation check for her latest Historical Society drive. but mostly to ensure I was actually leaving town on schedule. I drove away feeling the familiar, comforting rush of professional focus, completely unaware that my physical absence was the final, critical component of their insidious plan. I did not know that finishing my exhaustive audit in 2 days instead of 3 would be the tiny spark that ignited my entire world. I did not know that deciding to drive the 200 miles back early, hoping to surprise the man I deeply loved, would permanently shatter the pristine glass of my reality. I thought I was simply coming home to rest. I had absolutely no idea that my early return would aggressively pull the curtain back on a profound emotional betrayal. Nor did I suspect for a single second that it would expose a calculated, cold-blooded conspiracy to steal the only true home I had ever known. The drive from Savannah took exactly 2 hours and 45 minutes. I bypassed the main interstate entirely, opting for the winding coastal roads because my brain was already shifting out of audit mode. The logistics executives had folded much faster than my firm anticipated. Their fraudulent shipping ledgers were completely exposed by early Thursday afternoon. I packed my hotel room, settled the bill, and drove straight back to Belhaven. I wanted to surprise Cole. I pictured him in his home office, surrounded by material swatches for the historic renovation, drinking a cup of dark roast coffee. I pulled onto our street just as the sun began its final descent, casting long, deceiving shadows across the pristine lawns of our neighborhood. I parked my car 2 blocks away near the community clubhouse. It was a paranoid habit born from years of arriving unannounced at corporate headquarters to catch embezzlers completely off guard. I walked the rest of the way. I knew the gravel driveway would crunch loudly under my tires, and I wanted absolute silence. I reached the edge of our property. The evening air was thick with coastal humidity and the heavy scent of blooming jasmine. I unlatched the wooden side gate with practiced, silent ease. Instead of rolling my heavy suitcase over the paved walkway, I gripped the leather handle and lifted it entirely off the ground. My heels made zero sound on the soft grass as I bypassed the front door and headed straight toward the side porch. The sunroom sits at the very back of our house, framed by massive glass panes that look directly out onto the marsh. The interior lights were burning brightly, casting a warm golden glow against the approaching twilight. I stepped onto the wooden deck, staying close to the brick facade to avoid casting a shadow into the room. I moved toward the glass, fully expecting to see my husband drafting new blueprints. Instead, my eyes locked onto a tableau that brought my blood to an absolute, freezing standstill. Cole was standing near the center of the room. He was not alone. He was embracing a blonde woman. My initial thought process was highly clinical. I analyzed her posture, the expensive cut of her silk blouse, the unnatural stillness of the scene. Cole had his right hand resting flat against the small of her back. His fingers were tracing the fabric in a deeply familiar, practiced motion. It was not the stiff, polite touch of a contractor dealing with a wealthy client. It was an intimate, possessive grip. The woman shifted her weight, turning slightly into his chest. She tilted her face upward, letting out a laugh that I could not hear through the thick glass, but recognized instantly in my bones. It was Vivian, my own mother. A normal woman might have dropped her heavy luggage in shock. A normal wife might have slammed her fists against the glass panes, screamed until her vocal cords tore, or charged through the sliding doors to physically tear them apart. I did absolutely none of those things. The senior compliance director inside my brain immediately took total command of my central nervous system. I felt a sudden, profound drop in my core body temperature. It was a physical sensation identical to the exact moment I uncover a multi-million-dollar discrepancy in a corporate ledger. Panic is a completely useless emotion. Information is the only currency that matters. I quietly set my suitcase down on the wooden deck. I reached into my trench coat pocket and extracted my smartphone. I opened the camera application, switched it to video mode, and pressed the record button. I held the device perfectly steady. I framed the shot carefully to include their faces, the distinct lighting fixtures of my own sunroom, and the undeniable reality of their bodies pressed tightly together. I watched through the digital screen as my husband leaned down and kissed my mother. It was a long, unhurried kiss. It spoke of deep routine rather than sudden, uncontrollable passion. My hands did not shake. My breathing slowed to a deliberate, calculated rhythm. As they pulled apart, Cole murmured something that made Vivian smile. It was that practiced, camera-ready smile she usually reserved for wealthy donors at her charity galas. My eyes detached from their faces and began scanning the rest of the room. A good financial investigator never focuses solely on the primary subjects. The surrounding environment always holds the crucial corroborating evidence. I panned the camera downward, zooming in slightly on the heavy oak coffee table positioned directly in front of them. The table was cluttered, but not with casual domestic items. There were 2 crystal glasses of bourbon, both half empty. Beside them lay a wide, unrolled set of architectural blueprints. I recognized the distinctive elevation lines of Seabrook House immediately. But it was the specific items resting directly on top of those blueprints that made my pulse finally spike with cold. Hard realization. There was a thick manila folder. The label on the tab was printed in bold, block letters reading transfer packet. Resting parallel to the folder was a sleek, silver electronic signature pen. It was a highly specialized, high-tech device used specifically for authenticating digital legal documents. I had never owned such a device. Cole had never needed one for his standard contracting work. The disparate pieces slammed together in my mind with terrifying velocity. This was not a moment of weakness. This was not a drunken, spontaneous mistake born from temporary loneliness. People do not bring property transfer packets and electronic signature authentication devices to a casual romantic affair. This scene possessed the distinct, sterile stench of a premeditated corporate takeover. They were not just sleeping together behind my back. They were actively conducting high-stakes business. My absence in Savannah was not an unfortunate coincidence. It was a carefully scheduled window of opportunity. They were using my home, drinking my expensive liquor, and actively preparing to sign away the single most valuable asset I owned. The physical betrayal of the flesh was suddenly dwarfed by the sheer, staggering magnitude of the financial conspiracy. They were clearing the legal path to steal Seabrook House right out from under me. I had seen exactly enough to understand the threat level. If I confronted them right now, they would immediately scramble. They would invent plausible excuses, hide the legal paperwork, and cover their digital tracks before I could properly secure my assets. I needed them to believe they were still operating safely in the shadows. I stopped the video recording, ensuring the file was securely saved to my local storage and immediately synced to my private cloud server. I picked up my suitcase, lifting it with the exact same silent care as before. I backed away from the glass, retreating off the deck and stepping into the thick row of melaleuca trees that lined the edge of the driveway. The evening shadows swallowed me completely. I pulled my phone back out and dialed the only person on this earth who would understand the exact nature of this incoming war. I called my father, Daniel Romero. My parents had divorced over 20 years ago, precisely because Daniel saw through Vivian long before anyone else in Belhaven did. He lived on the quiet side of town, running a small land surveying business. He answered on the second ring. His voice was gravelly and tired from a long day in the sun. I did not say hello. I did not waste a single syllable on standard pleasantries. I spoke with the flat, mechanical precision of an automated system delivering a fatal error code. I told him I was standing in the bushes outside my own house. I told him I had just recorded Vivian kissing Cole in the sunroom. I paused for exactly 1 second before delivering the final, most crucial piece of data. I told him there was a transfer packet and an electronic signature pen sitting on top of the Seabrook House blueprints. I told him to get in his truck and come to my exact location immediately. He did not ask me if I was absolutely sure about what I saw. He did not tell me to take a deep breath, calm down, or think things over. He only said he was on his way before ending the call. I stood alone in the humid darkness, listening to the cicadas, and braced myself to methodically take apart the life I had built. I waited in the damp shadows beneath the melaleuca trees. Exactly 10 minutes later, the low rumble of an engine broke the quiet of the street. My father drove an ancient, battered pickup truck that groaned over every bump and pothole. It coasted to a stop near the edge of the property. Its headlights killed well before it reached the driveway. But he did not arrive alone. Right behind his rusted rear bumper glided a sleek black sedan. The doors opened with barely a whisper, blending perfectly with the coastal breeze. My father stepped out, his weathered face tight with immediate concern, followed by two distinct figures emerging from the sedan. I stepped out from the cover of the branches, the damp grass brushing against my ankles, my trench coat pulled tight against the sudden chill of adrenaline. As they approached, the dim streetlights caught the sharp, familiar profile of Nora Bell. Nora had been my grandmother Alma's estate lawyer for over 3 decades. She was a woman carved from absolute pragmatism, clad in a sharp gray suit even at this late hour. She possessed a mind like a steel trap and a total lack of patience for fools. Beside her stood a younger man I did not immediately recognize. He was clutching a thick leather briefcase to his chest. He had the anxious, hyper-alert energy of someone who lived entirely in spreadsheets, property lines, and dense legal databases. My father reached me first. He grabbed my shoulders, his rough hands grounding me in the present moment. I did not waste time with tears. I did not tremble. I simply unlocked my smartphone, pulled up the video file I had just captured, and handed the device directly to him. The bright screen illuminated his face in the dark. I watched his jaw clench, the muscles ticking furiously as he witnessed his ex-wife and his son-in-law caught in their grotesque embrace. He was entirely paralyzed by the visual proof of the betrayal, his breathing turning ragged and shallow. Nora, however, did not share his emotional paralysis. She leaned over his thick arm to look at the screen. She did not gasp in horror. She did not offer me any empty, comforting platitudes. Her eyes narrowed sharply behind her wire-rimmed glasses, and she instantly shifted from witnessing a messy family tragedy to analyzing a severe, high-stakes legal crisis. She handed the phone back to me and quickly introduced the man standing beside her. His name was Mason Pike. He was a senior title researcher working directly for the largest title insurance firm in the state. Nora explained that my father had called her while speeding frantically across town. Deeply alarmed by my cryptic mention of property documents sitting on the sunroom table, that frantic phone call had perfectly, horrifyingly aligned with a glaring anomaly Nora had discovered on her own desk earlier that very same day. Nora kept her voice down to a harsh, urgent whisper, wary of the open windows just 50 yards away. She told me her law office had received an automated county legal alert early this morning. A complete property transfer packet regarding Seabrook House had been formally submitted to the county clerk for a preliminary review. The timing of this submission was highly specific and entirely strategic. The filing was designed to clear just enough bureaucratic hurdles to be considered legally presentable before a massive donor announcement event scheduled for tomorrow night. My blood turned to absolute ice. Tomorrow night was the annual Heritage Conservation Gala, the exact high-profile event my mother had been obsessively organizing for the past 6 months. The situation escalating in front of me was far worse than a simple filing error or a misunderstood contract. Nora looked me directly in the eyes and delivered a blow that hit significantly harder than the video I had just recorded. She told me the transfer documents sitting at the county office were not blank templates. They were fully executed. The packet contained my verified electronic signature, firmly stamped on every single required line. Even more terrifying than the digital forgery, the signature was accompanied by a physical, legally binding notary seal, officially certifying that I had supposedly signed the documents in person under oath. I stated flatly, my voice completely devoid of emotion, that I had been locked in a conference room in Savannah for the past 3 days. I had not signed a single piece of paper, let alone authorized the total transfer of my grandmother's historic estate. Mason stepped forward, utilizing the hood of the black sedan as a makeshift desk. He popped the latches on his leather briefcase and pulled out a thickly printed dossier. He pointed a pen to the brightly highlighted sections on the top page. He confirmed that the fraudulent transfer was not conveying the massive property to my husband or my mother directly. They knew that would be too obvious, too easily contested in a standard divorce proceeding. Instead, the deed was being quietly and efficiently transferred into the corporate holdings of a newly formed limited liability company. The entity was legally registered under the name Low Harbor Restoration Partners. Mason had pulled the corporate filing just 2 hours ago, digging past the shell companies to find the true owners. The managing directors listed clearly on the corporate charter were Cole Danner and Vivian Romero. The sheer scale of the deception settled over the four of us like a suffocating lead blanket. The affair in the sunroom was merely the physical, recreational symptom of a massive financial disease. The romantic betrayal and the calculated property theft were not two separate, unfortunate events happening in parallel. They were the exact same operation. My mother and my husband were actively using their physical intimacy as the binding glue for their corporate conspiracy. They were systematically stealing my future, liquidating my inheritance, and they had manufactured the perfect, legally binding paper trail to execute the theft flawlessly. My father slowly looked toward the house. His fists were balled so tightly, his knuckles shone stark white in the dark. He took a heavy, violent step toward the gravel driveway, entirely prepared to kick the front door off its hinges, shatter the glass, and drag Cole out onto the lawn by his throat. He wanted immediate blood. He wanted to physically break the man who had humiliated his only daughter. I reached out and grabbed his arm. My grip was surprisingly strong, fueled by a sudden surge of pure, calculated adrenaline. I told him to stop right where he was. I explained the tactical reality of the situation. If we stormed into that house right now, we would undoubtedly catch them red-handed in their affair. There would be screaming, breaking glass, crying, and a deeply satisfying moment of chaotic confrontation, but they would also immediately realize the transfer packet on the table was compromised. Cole would instantly contact his fraudulent notary to cover their tracks. Vivian would leverage her immense social connections to push the paperwork through early the next morning. Worse still, they would completely destroy the physical evidence sitting right there on the coffee table before Nora could ever secure a legal injunction from a judge. They would have the crucial element of time. Time to delete their digital tracks, erase the corporate charters, dissolve the partnership, and spin a convincing public story that I was simply a hysterical, jealous, overworked wife making up wild financial lies to punish a cheating husband. I could not afford a messy, emotional domestic dispute. I needed a total, unquestionable legal slaughter. I needed to trap them so completely that neither their lies nor their social standing could save them. I looked at Nora and Mason, memorizing the grim determination on their faces. I told them we were leaving immediately. I told them I was going to turn my back on my own house, walk away from the husband I thought I knew, and leave my mother to her pathetic delusions of victory for one more night. I would disappear into the shadows without making a single sound. Because tomorrow, the very second the sun came up, I was going to systematically lock every single legal door, freeze every financial asset, and trap them inside the burning building of their own monumental arrogance. I picked up my suitcase from the damp grass, turned my back completely on the glowing windows of the sunroom, and climbed into the passenger seat of my father's rusted truck. We left the manicured streets of Belhaven behind, the tires of the old pickup truck humming a low, steady rhythm against the asphalt. We drove out to the industrial fringe of the county, past the salt marshes and the rusted boatyards, until we reached a corrugated metal building set back from the dirt road. This was the old surveying workshop belonging to my father. It smelled of ozone, stale coffee, and decades of rolled parchment. Dust motes danced in the harsh fluorescent lighting as he flipped the heavy breaker switch on the wall. The space was cavernous, drafty, and entirely off the grid of high society gossip. It was the perfect war room. I did not sit down. I dropped my leather bag onto a massive, scuffed oak drafting table and pulled out my work laptop. The machine hummed to life, casting a pale blue glow across my face. I engaged my virtual private network and began the systematic execution of a total digital lockdown. I moved with the rapid, muscle memory precision of a forensic auditor isolating a compromised corporate server. First went the joint checking and savings accounts. I transferred my personal liquid capital into a newly generated, secure holding account and scrambled the access credentials with random, 32-character alphanumeric strings. Next were the cloud storage drives, the shared family calendars, and my personal email servers. I severed the linked device authorizations, remotely logging out any machine that was not physically in my immediate possession. Finally, I accessed the smart home administration panel for our residents. I changed the master administrative protocols, completely locking out the man I had married from the security camera feeds, the automated lock logs, and the environmental controls. In less than 20 minutes, I had entirely amputated him from my digital existence. Nora watched me work, her arms crossed over her tailored gray suit. When I finally closed the administration terminal, she unclasped her leather briefcase and withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was the original, unaltered last will and testament of my grandmother. Nora smoothed the heavy paper flat against the drafting table, her manicured finger tapping firmly on a highly specific clause buried deep within the third section of the document. She looked up, her expression utterly devoid of sympathy and entirely focused on legal strategy. She reminded me of a conversation we had held 5 years ago, shortly after the funeral. The inheritance of the historic property came with an ironclad, non-negotiable stipulation. The estate could never be transferred, sold, or leveraged through any form of standard power of attorney. The binding text explicitly demanded that any alteration to the deed required my physical presence, my verifiable physical signature, and the direct countersignature of an independent, board-certified attorney acting as an impartial witness. The silence in the workshop grew incredibly dense. The implications of that single paragraph were staggering. It meant the transfer packet currently sitting in the county queue was not a clever exploitation of a legal loophole. It was not a simple misdirection of marital assets. It was a blatant, highly sophisticated felony. Someone had meticulously forged my signature and acquired a fraudulent notary seal to bypass a multi-million-dollar asset protection clause. Mason, who had set up his own terminal on a nearby metal workbench, suddenly swore under his breath. He had tapped into the back end of the county title database, tracing the digital footprint of the submitted transfer packet. He spun his monitor around so we could see the bright green lines of code cascading down the dark screen. He pointed to the exact submission timestamp. The documents had been uploaded to the municipal server at exactly 4:59 in the afternoon, a mere 60 seconds before the clerk office automatically closed for the weekend. The timing was a masterstroke of bureaucratic manipulation. By sliding the paperwork into the dark zone of the weekend queue, the newly formed corporate entity would register as the pending legal owner in the preliminary public registry by Saturday morning. It was a calculated maneuver designed to create an unassailable illusion of a completed deal. They needed that specific digital receipt to flash in front of the wealthy donors and the conservation board during the gala tomorrow night. They were using the sluggish pace of local government to manufacture a false reality, securing millions of dollars in pledges based on a stolen title. My father leaned heavily against a metal filing cabinet, rubbing a rough hand over his jaw. His eyes narrowed as a seemingly insignificant memory suddenly locked into place. He told us that 3 weeks ago, he had received a very strange piece of mail forwarded to his old residential address. It was a preliminary property tax reassessment notice specifically referencing the riverfront estate. At the time, he had simply assumed the county tax assessor had made a lazy administrative routing error. He had tossed it into his recycling bin without a second thought. Now, under the harsh fluorescent lights of the war room, the truth of that misdirected envelope was glaringly obvious. It was the very first test ping of their operation. They had been quietly manipulating the municipal mailing addresses, attempting to reroute all official county correspondence away from my home office to ensure I never saw the preliminary warnings of the impending title transfer. I stood completely still, staring blankly at the complex topological maps pinned to the corkboard opposite me, while a sickening wave of retrospective clarity washed over my brain. I rewound the tape of my entire marriage over the past 12 months. I recalled the late evenings in our kitchen. I remembered Cole sliding seemingly innocuous stacks of paper across the marble island while I was frantically typing compliance reports for my firm. He would kiss my cheek, pour me a glass of wine, and point to the bottom of the pages. He would tell me it was just a routine municipal waste permit, a minor structural repair authorization, or a supplementary application for a historical grant. I was always so exhausted, so deeply consumed by my 80-hour work weeks, that I had merely skimmed the cover pages and scribbled my name wherever he placed the pen. I realized with absolute certainty that he had been systematically harvesting my signature. He had been slipping malicious transfer documents into the middle of mundane contracting packets, building a verifiable history of my consent to create the perfect digital forgery. I had handed him the very means to ruin me simply because I trusted the man who shared my bed. A deep, icy calm settled over my entire body. The lingering shock evaporated, replaced entirely by the familiar surgical detachment that had made me the most feared investigator at my corporate firm. The woman who had blindly trusted her family was completely gone. The betrayed, heartbroken wife had been permanently eradicated. I looked at the three people standing around the drafting table. I swore to them, and to myself, that I would not react with the predictable hysterics of a scorned spouse. I would not file a standard, messy divorce and fight over the division of minor assets. I was officially clocking in. I was going to treat my mother and my husband exactly like the hostile, fraudulent corporate entities I dismantled for a living. They had motive. They had opportunity. They had a clear, undeniable financial incentive. And starting from this exact second, I was going to meticulously peel back every single layer of their conspiracy, secure every piece of damning evidence, and prepare to execute a flawless, catastrophic audit of their entire lives. My fingers moved across the keyboard of my laptop, cutting through the standard security protocols of our shared domestic network. I ignored the public folders containing our vacation photographs and joint tax returns, diving directly into the back-end architecture of the family cloud drive. A careless contractor always leaves a digital footprint. Cole utilized an automated synchronization protocol for his primary work computer. He incorrectly assumed that hiding a directory deep within a nested system folder would protect it from a casual glance. He completely forgot he was married to a woman who untangles offshore shell companies before her morning coffee. I extracted the hidden directory. The main folder title was simply a string of random letters, but the internal contents were meticulously organized down to the smallest detail. There were master spreadsheets containing 5-year revenue projections, glossy investor prospectuses bound in digital formatting, and preliminary vendor contracts for high-end commercial kitchen equipment. Every single document was officially stamped with the newly formed corporate identity: Low Harbor Restoration Partners. I opened the master business plan first, expanding the document across my entire screen. The true objective was laid out in crisp, professional typography. They were not restoring my ancestral home to preserve local history or honor the memory of my grandmother. They were utilizing the property as the core physical asset to underwrite an entirely new commercial venture. They envisioned a highly exclusive riverside supper club, a place where the absolute elite of Belhaven would pay tens of thousands of dollars merely for an annual membership. They had even commissioned a sleek, modern logo for it. The name of the venue was printed in bold black ink across the header of every page: Harbor Ember. I clicked through a subfolder containing internal communications. The digital email threads between my mother and her wealthy socialite friends were an absolute masterclass in deceptive philanthropy. Vivian heavily leveraged her impeccable reputation within the heritage conservation community to solicit massive financial pledges. Her written pitch was incredibly moving and entirely fabricated. She promised the generous donors that the historic property would be permanently donated to a newly established cultural foundation, ensuring its pristine preservation for future generations of our town. However, the secondary legal contracts attached to those very same emails told the actual story. The proposed cultural foundation was nothing more than a temporary legal holding pen. The fine print explicitly permitted the foundation to lease the property indefinitely to a commercial management group for a nominal fee of $1 per year. Harbor Ember would operate as a highly lucrative, for-profit hospitality venue, entirely shielded from public scrutiny by the nonprofit status of my mother and her fake charity organization. I shifted my focus to the construction estimates, pulling up the raw data files. As a senior corporate auditor, I read complex financial ledgers the way normal people read simple mystery novels. The narrative embedded in these specific numbers was sloppy, arrogant, and deeply revealing. Cole had deliberately inflated the restoration budget by hundreds of thousands of dollars. I traced the diverted funds line by careful line, cross-referencing the original architectural quotes with the newly modified expenditure sheets. Massive sums explicitly earmarked for critical structural stabilization and authentic historical masonry were being quietly funneled into entirely different categories. He was stripping the foundation repair budget to finance a state-of-the-art wine-tasting kitchen equipped with imported temperature control systems. He was reallocating the money meant for period-accurate slate roof tiles to purchase custom mahogany bars and imported leather furniture for private luxury membership rooms. He was literally cannibalizing the very bones of the historic house to build his modern, opulent supper club. But a deeper dive into his personal business accounts revealed an even more pathetic truth. I utilized a secondary backdoor access point to pull the external vendor payment logs stored in his private ledger. Cole was completely drowning in debt. The numbers painted a picture of a man in total freefall. He owed nearly $400,000 to his primary concrete and lumber suppliers, with invoices dating back over 6 months. He had taken out aggressive, short-term bridge loans to cover the basic weekly payroll for his contracting firm, and those specific loans were rapidly approaching their absolute default dates. The interest rates on those loans were suffocating, climbing past 18% compounding monthly. His daily cash flow was completely paralyzed. His business was a hollow shell entirely propped up by empty promises and delayed payments. He was not stealing the estate because he possessed a grand but twisted vision of architectural grandeur. He was stealing it because he was absolutely desperate. He desperately needed the physical asset of the unrestricted riverfront land to secure a massive commercial bank loan. Harbor Ember was not a passion project. It was a desperate financial life raft designed to keep his failing construction business from sinking completely into bankruptcy. My mother, on the other hand, did not need an immediate cash injection. Vivian possessed an entirely different kind of hunger. I read the transcribed minutes from a private board meeting she had saved in the archive. She was orchestrating this entire elaborate fraud to secure a singular, permanent title. She wanted to be officially named the honorary president of the Bellhaven Conservation Society. To achieve that supreme social elevation, she needed a monumental, legacy-defining project bearing her specific name. She needed to be the sole savior of the town heritage. She was perfectly willing to sacrifice her own daughter to build her ultimate vanity monument. The final, most devastating piece of evidence was not found within a complex financial spreadsheet. It was hidden in the mundane daily communications. I remembered the old tablet computer we kept on the kitchen counter. A shared device automatically synced to his primary mobile messaging account. I ran a specialized data recovery protocol from my laptop, a tool I typically use to catch embezzling executives, to pull the archived, deleted message threads from the local storage of that specific device. The extraction software successfully bypassed the encryption and reconstructed the raw text logs from the past 3 months. I sat in the cold, drafty workshop, surrounded by the silent support of my father and the legal team, and read the exact words they used when they thought no one in the world was looking. The casual, effortless cruelty of their digital exchange was breathtaking. Vivian did not refer to me by my given name. In a text message discussing the strict financial timeline of the property transfer and the impending donor gala, she simply called me the bankable daughter. It was a cold, transactional label that perfectly encapsulated her entire maternal philosophy. Cole replied to her message less than 2 minutes later. He did not defend me. He did not express a single ounce of guilt for the massive betrayal he was orchestrating. He simply assured her the legal delays were only temporary. He typed out a response stating that they just needed her to stay quiet for a few more weeks, and then the deed transfer would be completely irreversible. I stared at the glowing blue screen, reading those two specific lines over and over again. I did not feel sorrow. I did not feel the typical agony of a broken heart. I felt a profound, absolute emptiness that quickly and violently hardened into a diamond-sharp clarity. In that precise moment, the final lingering illusion of my entire life shattered completely. I understood with total, undeniable certainty that I had never truly been a wife to Cole, nor had I ever been a real daughter to Vivian. In their calculating eyes, I was merely a utility. I was a reliable source of steady income, a highly convenient digital signature, and a respectable last name they could wear like a tailored mask to legitimize their overwhelming, bottomless greed. They were not simply betraying my trust. They were actively building their entire future directly on top of my broken back. The heavy silence in the surveying workshop was finally broken by the sharp snap of brass latches. Nora reached deep into the secondary compartment of her leather briefcase. She withdrew a thick envelope made of heavy parchment paper. The flap was secured with a dark crimson wax seal, bearing the distinct crest of my grandmother. Nora placed it on the scuffed drafting table, her hand resting firmly over the aged paper. She told me Alma had entrusted this specific envelope to her legal care over 15 years ago. The instructions accompanying the document were absolutely rigid. Nora was only legally permitted to present this letter if the title of the riverfront estate was ever actively threatened by a member of our own bloodline. My fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden, overwhelming weight of the past colliding violently with the present. I broke the brittle wax seal and unfolded the thick pages. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, filled with sharp angles and elegant loops. I read the words written by a woman who had seen right through the polished facade of her own child. Alma did not waste time with soft sentimentality. She wrote with the blunt, uncompromising clarity of a matriarch facing the ugly truth of her lineage. The letter explicitly detailed a deeply buried family secret from nearly 3 decades ago. Alma revealed that when I was just a young girl, Vivian had secretly attempted to leverage the ancestral home. My mother had forged preliminary loan applications, desperately trying to use the historic property as collateral to fund a disastrous, highly speculative social investment scheme. She had wanted to bankroll an exclusive country club expansion to secure her position among the local elite. Alma had caught the fraudulent paperwork just days before the bank finalized the massive mortgage. My grandmother wrote that she loved her daughter with all the complex, painful devotion a mother possesses, but love did not blind her to reality. Alma stated plainly that Vivian fundamentally lacked any internal moral boundaries whenever her towering narcissism intersected with an opportunity for public fame. To Vivian, the historic estate was never a sanctuary of family memories or a sacred responsibility to be fiercely protected. It was merely a dormant financial asset, a grand stage prop waiting to be liquidated for her own personal glory. Alma bypassed my mother in the will because she knew, with absolute certainty, that handing Vivian the deed was equivalent to signing the death warrant of our entire family history. Reading those words did not induce a fresh wave of grief for my current broken marriage. Instead, it delivered a profound, chilling shock of recognition. The agonizing realization was not that my mother had suddenly decided to betray me today. The true horror was that this toxic pattern had existed my entire life. The betrayal was not a spontaneous crime of passion or a sudden lapse in judgment. It was a generational rot. Vivian had simply waited in the shadows for decades, biding her time until she found a willing accomplice greedy enough to help her execute the exact same heist she had failed to pull off 30 years ago. My father let out a long, ragged exhale. He leaned over the table, his eyes scanning the elegant handwriting of his former mother-in-law. The lines on his weathered face seemed to deepen under the harsh fluorescent lights. He confessed something he had held on to for entirely too long. He told me he had witnessed Vivian seething with naked, ugly jealousy every single time Alma showed me preferential trust. He saw the cold calculation in her eyes when the will was finally read. He admitted his own foolish complicity in the illusion. He had desperately wanted to believe that time, age, and the eventual arrival of her senior years would somehow soften the hardened, bitter edges of her heart. He thought the quiet peace of the coastal town would eventually cure her relentless hunger for status. He looked at me with deep, unmistakable regret and apologized for leaving me alone to defend a fortress he should have helped guard. Before I could tell him that I did not blame him for my mother being exactly who she was, the harsh ringtone of his cellular phone shattered the heavy atmosphere. He pulled the device from his flannel pocket, squinting at the caller identification. It was Laverne Shaw. Laverne was an elderly woman who lived in the modest cottage situated directly adjacent to the property line of my estate. She spent her days sitting on her back porch, keeping a sharp, watchful eye over the riverbank and the communal boat docks. My father had sent her a brief text message earlier in the evening, casually asking her if the perimeter of the house looked secure. He put the phone on speaker mode, setting it down next to the ancient blueprints. Laverne possessed a voice like dry autumn leaves scraping against pavement. She did not bother with pleasantries. She told my father she was calling because she knew something was deeply wrong over at the main house. She said she had been watching the property for the past 4 months, keeping her observations to herself because she did not want to be a gossiping neighbor. But tonight, seeing the sudden flurry of unfamiliar cars, she decided to speak up. Laverne stated clearly that my husband and my mother were not just having a casual affair. They were running a full-scale logistics operation. She told us that almost every single time I was scheduled to leave town on a corporate audit, their vehicles would arrive at the estate within an hour of my departure. They would park near the secluded back entrance, far away from the main road and the streetlights. But Laverne offered far more than just the anecdotal observations of a suspicious neighbor. She told us she had installed a high-definition security camera system on the eaves of her roof last year, after a series of minor boat thefts along the river. One of those cameras was pointed directly at the small, shared dock located behind my property. Laverne told us she had hours of recorded digital footage saved on her internal hard drive. She described exactly what her cameras had captured during the warm summer evenings while I was thousands of miles away dissecting corporate fraud. She saw Cole and Vivian making multiple trips from his heavy-duty work truck into the rear entrance of my home. They were not carrying groceries or romantic gifts. They were hauling massive, heavy cardboard boxes entirely filled with legal documents and architectural plans. They were carrying premium commercial construction material samples, industrial kitchen tiles, and heavy rolls of commercial-grade upholstery. Then, Laverne delivered the final, crushing blow. She vividly described a specific recording from exactly 3 weeks ago. She watched through her monitor as Cole carefully unloaded a large, custom-painted wooden sign from the bed of his truck. He carried it up the back steps with Vivian guiding him with a flashlight. Laverne had zoomed in on the object. She read the bold, modern lettering painted across the center of the wood. The sign bore the distinct, unmistakable logo of Harbor Ember. They were literally moving the physical branding of their fraudulent supper club into my private sanctuary while I was paying the mortgage. I stared at the glowing screen of the cellular phone, absorbing the absolute magnitude of the evidence suddenly laid out before me. The tactical landscape of this war had shifted entirely in the span of a single hour. When I first drove away from the house, I was merely a deeply wronged wife holding a 10-second digital recording of a disgusting physical betrayal. Now, standing in the dusty surveying workshop, I possessed an overwhelming, impenetrable arsenal. I had the documented history of their financial motives carefully extracted from the hidden cloud servers. I had the damning, undisputed testimony of a completely independent eyewitness. I held a handwritten confession from the grave explicitly detailing my mother and her historical pattern of real estate theft. And I now had access to months of time-stamped security footage proving this was not a sudden crime of opportunity, but a highly coordinated, premeditated corporate conspiracy designed to dismantle my life. They thought they were incredibly clever, operating silently in the shadows while I was distracted by my career, but they had carelessly left their fingerprints on every single surface they touched. The trap they had spent months building for me was completely finished. All I had to do now was lock the doors and watch them burn inside it. The atmosphere inside the cold, surveying workshop transitioned rapidly from the initial shock of discovery into a state of relentless and highly calculated execution. Nora paced the concrete floor, mapping out our immediate legal counteroffensive with the ruthless efficiency of a seasoned general preparing for a siege. We did not need to win the entire war before the sun came up. We only needed to drop a massive iron portcullis over their escape route. Following her explicit and uncompromising instructions, I drafted an emergency injunction designed specifically to block any pending transfer of the estate title. We worked in absolute silence straight through the dark hours of the early morning. By the time the wall clock struck 6, Nora had electronically filed a formal notice of pendency of action with the municipal court. This crucial document legally flagged the property title with an active and highly toxic dispute. This filing was scheduled to hit the main county clerk system at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, the precise second their digital doors opened for standard business operations. Simultaneously, Mason executed a parallel strike against their financial viability. He utilized his secure corporate credentials to issue an aggressive, system-wide fraud alert directly to the Central Title Insurance Underwriting Registry. This maneuver was the ultimate silent kill switch in the real estate industry. Any lawyer, any wealthy private investor, or any commercial bank attempting to run a routine preliminary background check on the riverfront property would instantly slam into a massive red wall of legal warnings. The registry would explicitly state that the physical asset carried severe legal risk, was under active litigation, and was strictly uninsurable for any commercial purpose. We had effectively turned the beautiful historic estate into radioactive financial material without making a single public accusation or raising our voices. While we locked down the legal grid, my cellular phone vibrated relentlessly against the wooden drafting table. Over the span of 4 hours, I received 22 missed calls and over 30 panicked text messages from my husband. He was awake, and he was desperately trying to control the narrative of his sudden exposure. I finally picked up the device and read his frantic and sweating words. He sent long and rambling apologies. He begged for a simple face-to-face conversation. He made desperate and pathetic claims that I was entirely misinterpreting the physical scene I had witnessed through the glass. I did not engage with his panic. I did not unleash my righteous anger. I typed out exactly 4 words. I need some time. I hit the send button and placed the phone face down. That brief and icy silence was a highly calculated strategic maneuver. It provided him with the exact illusion his ego desperately craved. It made him firmly believe that I was merely a devastated and heartbroken wife reeling from the mundane shock of marital infidelity. He genuinely thought I was hiding in a cheap motel room somewhere, crying uncontrollably over a broken marriage, completely oblivious to the massive corporate theft occurring right underneath the surface. My mother, ever the opportunist, immediately weaponized my silence to serve her own agenda. By noon, I was carefully monitoring the digital chatter across the local high society message boards and community groups. Vivian had already begun planting the seeds of her carefully constructed false narrative. She was actively calling her affluent committee members, using her softest and most deeply concerned maternal voice to whisper that her daughter was suffering from severe professional exhaustion. She spun a tragic and highly believable tale about how my grueling corporate schedule and relentless travel had finally caused a total mental collapse. She smoothly explained that my sudden and hysterical departure forced her and her highly capable son-in-law to temporarily step in and handle the heavy burden of managing the complex family estate. She was expertly laying down the necessary psychological groundwork. She was ensuring that if I tried to speak out later about the stolen deed, the town would simply view me as an unstable and overworked woman having a paranoid breakdown. I let her elaborate charade play out entirely uninterrupted. I did not block my husband from my communication channels. Instead, I carefully and methodically archived every single pathetic message he sent throughout the rest of the day. I saved his half-hearted and contradictory apologies to an external drive. I captured high-resolution images of his vague and manipulative explanations, where he repeatedly insisted that everything happening behind the scenes was far more complicated than I could possibly understand. He was desperately trying to build a shaky bridge of plausible deniability, completely unaware that I was happily collecting every single digital brick he threw to build his eventual prison cell. The most damning piece of secondary evidence arrived late in the afternoon. Despite completely revoking his administrative privileges earlier that night, I still maintained passive and undetectable monitoring access to the automated environmental microphones installed in the main living room of the estate. I pulled the raw audio logs from the previous night, specifically isolating the hours immediately after I had fled into the tree line. The digital playback was terrifyingly crisp. I listened to the sharp sound of ice clinking against heavy crystal glass. Then, Vivian spoke. Her tone was brutally sharp, entirely devoid of any maternal warmth, and ringing with pure and unadulterated entitlement. She sharply commanded him to stop pacing the floor and focus entirely on the upcoming gala. She explicitly stated that once they got up on that grand stage and officially announced the property transfer to the wealthy sponsors, the deal would be permanently locked in the court of public opinion. Then, she added a final and sickening caveat that sent a hard shiver down my spine. She told him that once the paperwork was public, I could cry for as long as I wanted. While they were busy rehearsing their grand deception in my living room, I contacted a former corporate colleague. He was a certified digital forensics expert who specialized in verifying cryptographic signatures for major international financial institutions. I securely transmitted a high-resolution copy of the forged transfer packet Mason had extracted from the county queue. It took the senior analyst less than 2 hours to completely confirm my darkest suspicions. The electronic signature stamped on the deed was not a fresh and original forgery. It was a sloppy digital clone. The forensic metadata embedded within the file proved beyond any reasonable doubt that the signature had been directly extracted and artificially reconstructed from an old and mundane home insurance renewal document I had signed nearly 3 years ago. The forgery was scientifically proven, mathematically undeniable, and completely ready to be presented in a federal courtroom. The trap was now completely set. Every single financial exit was heavily barricaded. Every conceivable legal loophole was permanently sealed shut, with concrete and verifiable evidence. A lesser investigator, or perhaps a more forgiving daughter, might have called the local authorities right then, shutting down the criminal operation quietly in the shadows to avoid a massive public scandal. But my mother had spent her entire adult life treating me like a disposable stepping stone to reach her beloved spotlight. She had built her entire towering social empire on the fragile and glittering illusion of her own absolute moral superiority and impeccable family values. I made a firm and irrevocable decision. I was not going to stop them from attending the biggest event of the conservation season. I was not going to break their pathetic scheme in the private comfort of a lawyer office. I was going to let them put on their expensive formal wear. I was going to let them ride together to the center of Belhaven in a luxury town car. I was going to allow my mother and my husband to confidently step onto the grandest stage of the year, completely surrounded by the wealthiest and most influential people in the entire county. They truly believed tomorrow night would be their ultimate coronation. They had absolutely no idea I had already spent the entire day turning their glittering throne into an execution block. The local media machine in Belhaven is a highly predictable beast, easily fed by expensive champagne and the promise of proximity to generational wealth. Over the course of a single afternoon, my mother transformed herself into the undisputed patron saint of the upcoming Wren House Restoration Ball. Her face, expertly contoured and photographed through a soft focus lens, was plastered across the digital homepages of every society publication in the county. She was heavily promoting her highly anticipated keynote address, aggressively teasing the announcement of a historic gift that would supposedly redefine the cultural landscape of our coastal enclave. The press releases, carefully drafted by her expensive public relations team, painted her as a tireless guardian of local history. Standing right beside her in every single promotional photograph was my husband. Cole had fully embraced his casting as the brilliant, ruggedly handsome visionary. He wore bespoke charcoal suits, effortlessly paired with an open collar, projecting the exact image of a modern contractor possessing both the muscle to swing a sledgehammer and the refined artistic sensitivity required to elevate a heritage site. The society columns fawned over him. They described him as the only man in the entire state capable of delicately weaving the deep historical roots of the property into a thriving modern cultural symbol. Together, Vivian and Cole looked like American royalty, a united front of impeccable taste and boundless philanthropy. The irony was so dense it was practically suffocating. They were standing on the absolute peak of a towering social pedestal, completely blind to the massive sinkhole I had just opened directly beneath their feet. While they were busy giving exclusive interviews to lifestyle magazines about their profound dedication to architectural preservation, I was quietly orchestrating a very different kind of social campaign. I did not waste my breath talking to journalists. I went straight to the oxygen supply of their entire operation. I systematically arranged private, off-the-record meetings with the three largest financial benefactors of the Conservation Board. These were the ultra-wealthy individuals whose massive, seven-figure charitable pledges were the absolute lifeblood of my mother's proposed foundation. I met the first donor at his private equestrian estate, the second in the heavily paneled dining room of the local country club, and the third in a discreet corner booth of a downtown steakhouse. I did not wear the face of a weeping, betrayed wife. I wore my tailored corporate armor. I did not mention the disgusting scene I had recorded through the sunroom glass. I did not utter a single syllable about my husband sleeping with my mother. I kept the conversation strictly confined to the sterile, unforgiving realm of risk management and corporate compliance. I sat across from each of these powerful men and women, sliding my untouched coffee cup aside, and asked them one highly specific, hypothetical question. I asked them exactly what would happen to their massive financial commitments if the core physical asset of the new cultural trust suddenly became entangled in a vicious, prolonged, and highly public title dispute. I watched the blood drain from their deeply tanned faces. Wealthy people do not become wealthy by throwing their capital into actively burning buildings. Their answers were unanimous and immediate. Without a legally spotless deed to the riverfront estate, every single promise my mother had made to them was entirely worthless. The foundation would be considered a toxic liability. They assured me, in no uncertain terms, that if a legal flag was raised, they would instantly freeze their pledged funds and publicly distance themselves from the entire project. That was all the confirmation I needed. The magnificent, glittering tower Vivian had built was resting entirely on a foundation of wet clay, but the most delicious, poetic revelation of the entire day did not come from the wealthy donors. It came from a secondary sweep of the encrypted financial communications I had extracted earlier. While analyzing the raw data files connected to the Low Harbor Restoration Partners corporate charter, I stumbled across a deeply buried, separate email thread. Cole was communicating through a private, heavily encrypted channel with a secondary group of aggressive commercial real estate investors based out of Atlanta. I read the digital correspondence and actually had to suppress a harsh, barking laugh. My husband was not just running a massive fraud against me. He was actively running a secondary, highly calculated con entirely behind my mother's back. He had explicitly promised these private investors that once the supper club was fully constructed and the revenue stream stabilized, he would initiate a hostile corporate takeover. He laid out a precise financial roadmap to aggressively dilute Vivian's controlling equity, systematically pushing her out of the managing board entirely. He was using her impeccable social connections to secure the initial zoning approvals and the donor funding, but he had absolutely no intention of sharing the final, lucrative kingdom with her. They were two starving wolves hunting together, each secretly planning to slaughter the other the very second the prey was secured. Vivian, blissfully unaware of the trap waiting right behind her, was busy preparing her own move against me. A leaked draft of her upcoming gala speech automatically synced to the shared cloud server, and I read every single nauseating word of it. The manuscript was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. She had heavily padded the text with soaring, tear-jerking rhetoric about the sanctity of family, the deep weight of ancestral memories, and the profound, unsung sacrifices of a mother. She was preemptively weaponizing the sacred concept of motherhood. She knew there was a slight risk I might try to legally contest the transfer once the news broke. So, she was deliberately painting herself as the selfless matriarch, stepping in to save the family legacy because her corporate-obsessed daughter had tragically lost her way. She planned to use the pristine image of a loving mother to force the entire court of public opinion onto her side, completely isolating me. I closed the document, feeling a cold, diamond-hard resolve settle permanently into my chest. The very moment she chose to use family morality as a cheap coat of paint to cover her theft, she gave me the exact timing for my strike. I would not interrupt the cocktail hour. I would not cause a scene during the silent auction. I would wait for the precise second she stepped up to the microphone and draped herself in that fake, moral superiority. I would let her build the facade up to the highest possible ceiling before I smashed it to pieces right in front of her adoring audience. The night before the grand event, I sat alone in a sterile, brightly lit hotel room located 2 towns over. The heavy curtains were drawn tightly shut. My cellular phone sat on the nightstand, constantly illuminating the dark room with incoming notifications. I watched the screen silently register over 20 desperate phone calls and an endless stream of frantic text messages from Cole. He was practically begging for a response, pleading for a chance to explain, swearing that everything he was doing was ultimately for our shared future. I did not pick up the device. I did not type a single letter in reply. I let the silence stretch out into the early hours of the morning. I let him toss and turn in our bed, deeply wrapped in the pathetic illusion that his silence meant I was weak, that my absence meant I was defeated. I let him sleep peacefully, entirely convinced he still had a viable way back into my good graces, while every single one of his financial exits had already been permanently padlocked from the outside. The trap was heavily loaded, the bait was perfectly set, and the 2 most arrogant people I had ever known were gleefully sprinting straight toward the steel jaws. The evening of the Wren House Restoration Ball arrived with a suffocating blanket of coastal humidity and the sickeningly sweet scent of blooming jasmine. The entire financial and social elite of Belhaven descended upon the grand historic theater located right on the edge of the central town square. It was a massive, ornate building constructed in the 1920s, dripping with faded gold leaf and heavy crimson velvet. Vivian absolutely adored hosting her events in this specific venue. She loved it not for its architectural significance, but because the antique crystal chandeliers cast a very specific, warm amber glow that successfully erased at least 15 years from her heavily powdered face. The lobby was packed tight with men wearing bespoke black tuxedos and women draped in silk and heavy diamond jewelry. Waiters navigated the crowded floor carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of imported champagne. The air was thick with the distinct, metallic smell of old money and desperate social climbing. It was the perfect, glittering stage for a massive public deception. I did not arrive during the chaotic cocktail hour. I timed my entrance for maximum impact, waiting until the heavy wooden doors of the main auditorium were closed and the wealthy guests were securely seated at their assigned dinner tables. When I finally pushed through the brass-handled double doors, I was not wearing the soft, pastel colors my mother always aggressively suggested to make me look more approachable. I wore a tailored, floor-length gown the color of a bruised midnight sky. It was dark blue, bordering on absolute black, with sharp, architectural lines and absolutely no lace or embellishments. It was not a dress designed for a festive celebration. It was tailored corporate armor. I did not walk into the theater alone. I moved down the center aisle, flanked by a highly specialized execution squad. My father walked on my right. He looked entirely out of place among the silk lapels and expensive haircuts, wearing a stiff, dark suit that pulled tightly across his broad shoulders, but he radiated an intimidating, protective gravity. On my left strode Nora Bell, looking exactly like a great white shark swimming through a tank of colorful, oblivious tropical fish. Right behind us hurried Mason Pike, clutching his heavy leather briefcase tight to his chest. Bringing up the rear were 2 men wearing completely unremarkable gray suits. They were licensed civil process servers, and their inner jacket pockets were heavily loaded with freshly signed court injunctions and civil lawsuits. The sudden sound of the heavy doors echoing through the quiet theater caused a ripple of turned heads. Vivian was standing near the front of the room, surrounded by a tight circle of local politicians and wealthy benefactors. I watched her perfectly manicured face as her eyes locked onto mine. For exactly one fraction of a second, the polished mask completely slipped. Her jaw tightened, and a sharp flash of genuine, cold panic widened her eyes. But Vivian was a seasoned professional in the art of social warfare, before the people standing next to her could even register her shock. She smoothed the panic away and manufactured a blinding, brilliant smile. She immediately placed her hand over her heart and projected a voice full of fake maternal relief, loudly whispering to the mayor that her deeply overworked daughter had miraculously managed to find the time to support the family after all. Cole, however, lacked her ironclad composure. He was standing near the edge of the stage, holding a glass of bourbon. When he saw me marching down the aisle with an entourage of lawyers, the blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. He set his drink down so hard the crystal stem nearly snapped. He broke away from the crowd and rushed toward me, intercepting my path halfway down the aisle. He reached out with trembling hands, desperately trying to grab my elbow and pull me into the shadows of the side columns. He leaned in close, his breath reeking of alcohol and pure fear, whispering frantically that I needed to step outside with him immediately so he could explain everything. I did not stop walking. I did not raise my hand to push him away. I simply shifted my weight and continued moving forward, forcing him to stumble awkwardly backward to avoid a collision. I looked directly through his face as if he were made of clear glass. I walked past my husband exactly the way one walks past a discarded, broken piece of furniture left on the side of the road. I gave him absolutely nothing. No anger, no tears, no acknowledgement of his existence. He was left standing alone in the aisle, completely paralyzed by my total indifference. We took our positions at a large, empty table situated directly in the center of the room, perfectly aligned with the main podium. The lights dimmed further, and a hushed, expectant silence fell over the wealthy crowd. A spotlight pierced the darkness, illuminating the grand stage. Vivian glided up the wooden steps, her heavy silk dress rustling elegantly against the floorboards. She took her place behind the microphone, looking out over the sea of faces with the serene, benevolent expression of a ruling monarch. She began to deliver the speech I had already read on the stolen digital server. It was a terrifyingly perfect performance. She possessed a mesmerizing, honeyed voice that effortlessly commanded the massive room. She spoke passionately about the heavy, sacred weight of local heritage. She seamlessly transitioned into a deeply emotional monologue regarding the vital role of women as the quiet, enduring guardians of family history. She strategically lowered her voice to a compassionate, sorrowful register, as she lamented how the younger generation was often entirely too consumed by the relentless pursuit of corporate wealth to truly understand the priceless value of their own roots. The hypocrisy rolling off the stage was so thick, it was physically nauseating. I watched the audience carefully. Wealthy dowagers nodded in solemn agreement, pressing lace handkerchiefs to their eyes. Powerful businessmen clapped softly, deeply moved by her poignant observations. Vivian was putting on an absolute masterclass in emotional manipulation, perfectly weaponizing the concept of a loving, sacrificial mother to sell her massive lie to the highest bidders in the room. As the applause swelled, she raised her hand to quiet the crowd, signaling the arrival of the grand finale. The stage manager wheeled out a small, antique wooden table. Resting directly in the center of the table was the thick transfer packet containing the forged digital signature. Vivian placed her hand reverently on top of the fraudulent documents. She flashed a triumphant smile toward the flashing cameras of the local press corps gathered near the front row. Her voice echoed through the high, vaulted ceiling. She grandly announced that it was time to officially secure the future of the riverfront estate. She extended her arm, inviting the major financial sponsors and her brilliant, dedicated son-in-law to join her on the stage for the formal commitment ceremony. This was the exact moment they had meticulously planned for months. This was the precise second they believed the trap would snap shut, legally binding the stolen property to their newly formed corporate entity while the entire town clapped and cheered. The wealthy donors began to rise from their chairs, adjusting their tuxedos and smiling for the photographers. Cole took a deep, shaky breath and took his first step toward the stairs leading up to the stage. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped sharply against the floor. I stood up. I did not scream. I did not throw a glass. I did not create a chaotic, emotional spectacle. I simply planted my feet firmly on the ground, lifted my chin, and projected my voice with the exact same carrying volume I used when addressing a hostile boardroom of embezzling executives. I told her to stop exactly where she was. My voice was not hysterical. It was cold, flat, and surgically precise. It sliced through the warm applause and the soft instrumental background music like a polished steel blade. The entire auditorium froze instantly. Every single head in the massive room snapped around to look at the woman standing alone in the dark blue dress. The flashing lights of the press cameras abruptly ceased. The wealthy donors froze awkwardly in the aisles. Cole stopped dead in his tracks, his foot hovering over the bottom step of the stage. Vivian stood completely paralyzed behind the wooden podium, her hand still resting on the forged documents, her triumphant smile slowly fracturing into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. I looked directly into my mother's eyes, fully prepared to tear her beautiful, glittering world completely to the ground. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute command in my tone caused the entire auditorium to fall into a deathly, suffocating silence. I walked purposefully down the center aisle, the heavy fabric of my dark gown brushing sharply against the velvet chairs. I told my mother to step away from the antique table and to take her hands off the heavily forged documents immediately. Vivian froze, her eyes darting nervously toward the wealthy benefactors sitting in the front row. Before she could summon another carefully constructed lie, Nora Bell stepped into the bright stage lights. My attorney did not mince her words or attempt to soften the blow. She held up the freshly stamped emergency court injunction, projecting her voice effortlessly to reach the very back row of the Grand Theater. She officially announced to the entire high society assembly that the transfer of the historic riverfront estate was entirely halted by a federal judge due to severe legal discrepancies. While Nora held their absolute attention, Mason Pike moved swiftly through the tables of the primary financial sponsors. He did not hand out elegant party favors. He distributed crisp, legally binding summaries of the active title dispute. He highlighted the corporate registry of the newly formed shell company, proving definitively that my mother and my husband were the sole managing directors attempting to quietly seize the core asset. The wealthy investors reading the documents immediately understood they were not witnessing a messy, unfortunate family misunderstanding. They were looking directly at a massive, radioactive legal liability that threatened their own pristine reputations. Vivian gripped the edges of the wooden podium. Her knuckles turned stark white under the pressure. She desperately attempted to pivot the collapsing narrative back to the emotional high ground. She forced heavy tears into her eyes, seamlessly adopting the tragic persona of a long-suffering, deeply concerned parent. She spoke softly into the microphone, claiming that I was deeply traumatized, suffering a severe mental collapse due to my grueling corporate schedule, and acting out of temporary paranoia. She placed a hand over her heart and declared that it was a mother's heavy, eternal responsibility to protect her child from their own destructive behavior. I did not argue with her pathetic, glittering performance. I simply reached into my clutch and retrieved my smartphone, which was already wirelessly linked to a highly amplified portable speaker held firmly by my father. I pressed a single button. The crystal-clear audio extracted from the smart home environmental microphones echoed loudly across the silent theater. The entire social elite of Bellhaven listened to Vivian's own voice, completely stripped of all its fake maternal warmth, coldly laughing and telling my husband that once the papers were signed on stage, I could cry for as long as I wanted. The collective gasp from the audience was practically deafening. Vivian stumbled backward as if she had been physically struck across the face. I walked directly over to the main table where the board of directors and the primary donor sat completely frozen in shock. I did not project the disgusting truth onto the massive stage screen for the entire room to consume. I simply placed a digital tablet in the center of their pristine white tablecloth and pressed play on the footage I had recorded through the sunroom glass. It took exactly 10 seconds for the most powerful people in the county to watch my husband intimately kissing my mother. I watched the profound, sickening disgust wash over their wealthy faces. In less than 1 minute, the immaculate moral facade Vivian had spent decades carefully building completely disintegrated into ash. Panic totally consumed Cole. He realized the entire operation was collapsing and desperately tried to save himself from the wreckage. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Vivian, shouting over the rising murmurs of the angry crowd that she was the true mastermind. He cowardly claimed she had ruthlessly manipulated his struggling business finances and aggressively forced him into the fraudulent scheme. I turned to him, my expression entirely hollow and devoid of mercy. I reached into my father's jacket pocket, retrieved a thickly printed stack of encrypted investor emails, and handed them directly to Vivian. I told her to read exactly how her loyal son-in-law had meticulously planned to dilute her equity and execute a hostile corporate takeover the very second their exclusive supper club opened its doors. Vivian stared at the highlighted emails, her mouth opening and closing silently as the profound realization of her own expendability finally hit her. She realized she was never the queen of the chessboard. She was just another disposable, easily manipulated pawn in his desperate financial game. Before Cole could attempt another desperate, sweating lie, the two process servers stepped smoothly out from the shadows of the side aisle. They approached him with cold, mechanical efficiency, pressing heavy manila envelopes firmly into his chest. They announced loudly, ensuring the local press corps heard every single word, that he had been officially served with immediate divorce proceedings, a massive civil lawsuit for corporate fraud, and a binding federal mandate for total evidence preservation. The lead financial benefactor, a man who detested public scandal more than anything else on earth, abruptly stood up from his chair. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket and loudly declared to the room that his charitable trust was immediately and permanently withdrawing all financial commitments from the project. The board organizers scrambled onto the stage in a total panic, waving their hands to signal the absolute cancellation of the commitment ceremony. The president of the Conservation Society, desperate to save the reputation of his own organization, approached Vivian and coldly informed her that her honorary status was suspended indefinitely pending a full legal investigation. I did not scream in victory. I did not pump my fists or demand a tearful apology. I stood perfectly still in the center of the chaotic, crumbling gala. I stated with absolute, ringing clarity that my grandmother's home would never be reduced to a cheap stage for anyone's bottomless greed. Then, I turned my back on the magnificent wreckage. I walked out through the heavy wooden doors into the cool night air before my mother could utter a single pathetic excuse or my husband could drop to his knees to beg for mercy. The knots were untangled with surgical precision over the following months. The fraudulent property transfer failed entirely, blocked permanently by the ironclad evidence. The luxurious supper club project collapsed instantly into a towering mountain of unpaid debt and severe legal fees. My marriage was terminated on my absolute, uncompromising terms, leaving Cole financially ruined and completely exiled from the local contracting industry. Vivian lost the only thing she ever truly loved. She became a total social pariah, permanently stripped of her influential committees, her fake charitable foundation, and her glittering public image built entirely on hypocrisy. As for the historic riverfront estate, I finally began the restoration exactly the way my grandmother Alma had always envisioned. I did not build an exclusive commercial venue for the wealthy. I poured my resources into carefully preserving the original architecture, transforming the sprawling property into a small, quiet, and deeply peaceful retreat. I named it Alma House. And for the very first time in its long, beautiful history, the house truly belonged to a woman who knew exactly how to protect it. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.